Welcome back to From VHS Horror Rentals to Modern Remakes, Part 3. By now, it's clear that the classics never truly stay in the past. The deeper we dig into the shelves of the VHS era, the more we see how these stories refuse to fade, resurfacing decades later with new faces, new effects, and new interpretations. Some remakes sharpen the terror for a new generation, while others stumble, trying to bottle lightning twice. From telekinetic revenge and small-town bloodshed to haunted mansions, cursed soil, and suburban spirits that won't rest, this round continues the journey through horror's evolving cycle. Once again, we'll hit rewind and see which modern versions honored the legacy, and which ones proved that not every nightmare needs a second awakening. Child's Play, 1988. Remade as Child's Play, 2019. Before the 2019 remake turned Chucky into a malfunctioning smart toy, Child's Play from 1988 gave us something far more sinister. A doll with a human soul and a personality that refused to die. Directed by Tom Holland and written by Don Mancini, the original follows a struggling single mother who gives her son Andy a good guy doll for his birthday, unaware it's possessed by the soul of serial killer Charles Lee Ray. What starts as a sweet gift becomes a waking nightmare as Chucky reveals himself, leaving a trail of chaos and disbelief behind him. What could have been absurd instead became iconic. Child's Play hit the perfect balance between dark humor and genuine terror. Brad Dourif's voice performance gave Chucky life, snarky, foul-mouthed, and terrifyingly human. The animatronics were groundbreaking for the time, giving the doll an uncanny realism that made every smirk and twitch unforgettable. When it hit VHS, Child's Play became an instant rental legend. The cover alone, that grinning doll mid-swing with a knife, was enough to make kids stop in their tracks. Parents hated it. Video stores couldn't keep it in stock, and it quickly spawned a franchise that grew weirder, funnier, and more self-aware with each sequel. Chucky wasn't just a villain, he was a brand. The 2019 remake, directed by Lars Klevberg, completely rewired. The premise gone was the voodoo and possession, replaced with artificial intelligence gone wrong. This Chucky wasn't cursed. He was programmed to learn, and he learned all the wrong lessons. Voiced by Mark Hamill, the new doll was less evil and more tragic, a product of neglect and malfunction. The kills were inventive, the tone darker, and the message timely. Horror born from technology, not black magic. It was a clever update, but it lost something of the original's personality. The first Child's Play was handmade, dirty, weird, and full of life. The remake was sleeker, colder, and calculated. One was chaos on film, the other an algorithm of fear. On VHS, the original Child's Play felt alive, a whisper from the shadows of the toy aisle, daring you to press play and see if that doll really could move on its own. The Evil Dead, 1981, remade as Evil Dead, 2013. Before the 2013 remake drenched theaters in blood and thunder, The Evil Dead from 1981 was already a legend, a no-budget explosion of creativity that redefined independent horror and became a cornerstone of the VHS era. Directed by a 20-year-old Sam Raimi and starring his childhood friend Bruce Campbell, The Evil Dead was made for almost nothing, shot in a real cabin in the Tennessee woods, and powered by pure ambition. The setup couldn't be simpler. 5 friends head to a remote cabin for a weekend getaway, discover a strange book bound in human skin, the Necronomicon, and accidentally unleash something ancient, violent, and unstoppable. What follows is one of the most intense and inventive horror films ever made. Raimi turned the camera into a living thing, swooping through the forest like an invisible demon, breaking every rule of low-budget filmmaking in the best way possible. The result was raw, frantic, and unlike anything that came before it. On VHS, The Evil Dead became a phenomenon. It was banned in several countries, labeled as a video nasty in the UK, and traded secretly among fans who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The gore was over the top, the performances were manic, and the energy was electric. This wasn't studio horror, it was independent cinema pushed to its absolute limit. The 2013 remake, directed by Fede Alvarez, paid genuine respect to the original while carving its own path. It replaced Raimi's dark humor with pure, unrelenting dread, a brutal, modern reimagining that focused on addiction, pain, and possession. It's louder, meaner, and slicker, but it never feels like an insult. It's a love letter, one made with gallons of blood and reverence for the original spirit. Still, nothing can replace the 1981 version's charm. You can feel the dirt, the sweat, the cold of that cabin, and the passion of a young filmmaker making something bigger than himself. The Evil Dead wasn't just a horror film. It was proof that all you really needed to make one was a camera, your friends, and the guts to go for it. It's messy, it's chaotic, it's magic. And for horror fans, it will always be the ultimate VHS success story. Friday the 13th, 1980, remade as Friday the 13th, 2009. Before the 2009 reboot reimagined Camp Crystal Lake for a new generation, Friday the 13th from 1980 was the movie that took the slasher formula and gave it a machete. It didn't invent the genre, but it perfected the structure, the isolated setting, the rhythmic kills, and the unseen killer moving just outside the frame. Directed by Sean S. Cunningham, the original follows a group of young counselors reopening a summer camp shut down years earlier after a tragic drowning. They're just trying to bring life back to Camp Crystal Lake until something starts picking them off, one by one. It's simple, almost brutally so, but it's that simplicity that made it iconic. What Friday the 13th lacked in polish, it made up for in atmosphere. The camera drifts like a predator. The sound design is raw, the woods feel endless, and Tom Savini's practical gore effects still hold up today. When it hit VHS, Friday the 13th exploded. It became one of the most rented horror films of the decade, the kind of tape you watched with friends just to see who'd flinch first. It was gritty, unpredictable, and mean. And by the time the sequels arrived, Jason Voorhees had become a horror icon. The hockey mask, the machete, the heavy breathing in the dark. He was born on home video as much as he was in theaters. The 2009 remake, directed by Marcus Nispel, knew what fans wanted and delivered it at full volume. It combined elements from the first four films into one relentless survival story. This time, Jason was the killer from the start. Faster, more tactical, and terrifyingly human. The kills were brutal, the visuals sleek, and the pacing relentless. It was less mystery, more mayhem. A modernized version of everything Friday the 13th was known for. It's loud, violent, and unashamed of what it is. A slasher for the HD era with the soul of a VHS tape. The original remains a classic because it feels dangerous. The remake succeeds because it remembers why. On VHS, Friday the 13th was the ultimate summer nightmare. The sound of crickets, the glint of moonlight on water, and the feeling that once you press play, there's no way out of the woods. The Wicker Man, 1973. Remade as The Wicker Man, 2006. Before the 2006 remake turned into an internet meme of bees and bad decisions, The Wicker Man from 1973 was something entirely different. A haunting cerebral folk horror masterpiece that blended mystery, music, and pagan ritual into one of the most unsettling films of its time. Directed by Robin Hardy and written by Anthony Shaffer, the film follows Sergeant Neil Howie, a devoutly Christian police officer who travels to the remote Scottish island of Summerisle to investigate the disappearance of a young girl. What he finds isn't just deception. It's an entire community that's turned its back on Christianity, embracing ancient pagan traditions that celebrate nature, fertility, and sacrifice. Edward Woodward plays Howie with a quiet conviction that slowly unravels into desperation, while Christopher Lee delivers one of his most iconic performances as Lord Summerisle, charming, intelligent, and utterly terrifying in his calm certainty. The film feels more like a ritual than a movie, luring the audience in with folk songs, strange dances, and a growing sense of dread that something deeply wrong is happening beneath the surface. Unlike typical horror of the era, The Wicker Man doesn't rely on jump scares or gore. It's psychological, almost dreamlike, where the horror comes from cultural collision. Faith against faith. Old world against new. By the time Howie realizes the true nature of his fate, the story transforms into something mythic, tragic, and unforgettable. When The Wicker Man arrived on VHS, it carried with it a strange power. The washed-out colors and grainy texture only deepened its mystery, as if you were watching something you weren't supposed to see. A lost ritual captured on tape. It became a cult favorite among collectors, passed around like forbidden knowledge. The 2006 remake, starring Nicolas Cage, tried to modernize the story, but lost the subtle terror that made the original so powerful. It turned allegory into absurdity, and its unintentional camp turned it into internet folklore. But that only made the 1973 version feel more sacred, a reminder of how horror can disturb without showing a drop of blood. The Wicker Man remains one of the most haunting films ever made, not because of what it shows, but because of what it believes. On VHS, it felt like a warning, one whispered through firelight and folk song, daring you to look closer. Carrie, 1976. Remade as Carrie, 2013. Before the 2013 remake tried to modernize it with cell phones and CGI, Carrie from 1976 was pure raw emotion, a tragic explosion of teenage pain, repression, and revenge that defined what horror could be in the VHS era. Directed by Brian De Palma and based on Stephen King's first novel, Carrie tells the story of a shy high school girl tormented by her classmates and controlled by her fanatically religious mother. When Carrie discovers she has telekinetic powers, the ability to move things with her mind, her world shifts from humiliation to something far more dangerous. Sissy Spacek's performance is what makes Carrie unforgettable. She plays her not as a monster, but as a wounded, innocent soul just trying to belong. You feel every ounce of her loneliness, her confusion, and finally, her rage. Piper Laurie matches her perfectly as Margaret White, Carrie's mother, a portrait of religious mania so intense it feels biblical. Together, they form one of horror's most powerful duos, victim and tormentor, bound by blood and fear. De Palma directs with operatic style, split screens, slow motion, and hypnotic camera moves that build to one of the most iconic finales in cinema history. The prom sequence, drenched in blood and horror, is both devastating and beautiful. It's not just a massacre, it's a moment of total transformation. A girl finally seen, but only through destruction. When Carrie arrived on VHS, it became a staple of every horror shelf. The picture's flicker and muted color made it feel like a ghost story recorded from a nightmare. It wasn't just scary. It was sad, poetic, and human. The 2013 remake, directed by Kimberly Pierce and starring Chloe Grace Moretz, tried to stay faithful to the source, while updating its social context, cyberbullying, viral videos, modern cruelty. It's competent, even sympathetic, but it never captures the same fragile magic. The original Carrie feels timeless because it's about more than telekinesis or revenge. It's about what happens when pain festers too long, when the outcast finally breaks. Few horror films have ever felt so personal, so tragic, and so alive. On VHS, Carrie was a warning that the real horror isn't in monsters or demons, but in the cruelty people carry inside. Fright Night, 1985, remade as Fright Night, 2011. Before the 2011 remake tried to bring vampires into the digital age, Fright Night from 1985 was one of the most stylish and self-aware horror films of the VHS era, a perfect blend of scares, humor, and 80s neon charm. Written and directed by Tom Holland, the movie follows teenager Charlie Brewster, a kid who discovers that his new neighbor, Jerry Dandridge, isn't just a charming bachelor. He's a vampire. When nobody believes him, Charlie turns to late-night horror host Peter Vincent, played by the great Roddy McDowall, for help. What follows is part monster movie, part love letter to classic horror itself. At a time when slashers were dominating the genre, Fright Night stood out for bringing gothic horror back to suburbia. It had practical effects that were both impressive and grotesque, transformations, smoke, fangs, and creatures that felt alive under the flicker of blue and red light. But it also had heart. Charlie was a believable kid. The vampire was dangerously likable, and Peter Vincent was the bridge between old-school monster movies and the new wave of 80s horror. When it hit VHS, Fright Night exploded. It was the perfect rental, part comedy, part horror, full of energy, and endlessly rewatchable. The cover, that haunted face forming from the clouds above a suburban house, became one of the decade's most iconic pieces of horror artwork. The 2011 remake, starring Colin Farrell and Anton Yelchin, was solid in its own right, faster, funnier, and packed with effects. But like many remakes from that era, it traded atmosphere for adrenaline. The original thrived on mood and personality. You could smell the dry ice, feel the fog, and hear that synth score creeping in as night fell. In the VHS era, Fright Night was the kind of movie that made horror fun again, a reminder that monsters could be scary and cool at the same time. It was a bridge between Hammer horror and the MTV generation, and it still holds up better than most of its imitators. No matter how many versions come after, the 1985 Fright Night remains one of the best vampire films ever made. Playful, clever, and dripping with 80s magic. My Bloody Valentine, 1981, remade as My Bloody Valentine 3D 2009. Before the 2009 remake tried to turn it into a 3D bloodbath, My Bloody Valentine from 1981 was one of the purest, grittiest slashers to come out of the VHS era. A working-class horror story that stood out in a decade full of copycats. Directed by George Mihalka, the original takes place in the small mining town of Valentine Bluffs, where a group of young workers decide to throw a Valentine's Day dance, the first one since a mining accident years earlier that left several men dead and gave birth to the legend of Harry Warden, a miner who supposedly went insane and murdered his co-workers. As the celebration returns, so does the killing. Unlike many of its contemporaries, My Bloody Valentine wasn't set in suburbia or summer camp. It's cold, industrial, and full of grit. The mines are dark, narrow, and claustrophobic. Real tunnels, not studio sets. And that authenticity gives it an edge most slashers never had. You can almost smell the coal dust and sweat. The kills, handled with practical makeup and creative setups, are brutal but never cartoonish. They feel grounded, quick, messy, and human, and that's what makes the movie work. It's not about teenagers getting picked off for fun. It's about an entire town haunted by its own history, repeating the same mistakes one Bloody Valentine after another. When it hit VHS, My Bloody Valentine became an underground favorite. Censors hacked out over 5 minutes of gore from the theatrical release, so collectors hunted for uncut versions for years. The 2009 remake brought back the premise but swapped subtlety for spectacle. More blood, more bodies, and of course 3D gimmicks. It was entertaining in that mid-2000s way, but it lost the small-town charm and blue-collar authenticity of the original. The 1981 version feels handmade, grimy, cold, and honest, the kind of movie that couldn't exist outside that era. My Bloody Valentine isn't just a slasher, it's a time capsule, a story about guilt, trauma, and the ghosts we create when we try to bury the past. On VHS, it looked perfect, grainy, dark, and flickering like the light from a miner's helmet. Pet Sematary, 1989. Remade as Pet Sematary, 2019. Before the 2019 remake tried to dig up Stephen King's story for a new generation, Pet Sematary from 1989 was already one of the most unsettling and emotional horror films to come out of the VHS era, a story about grief, loss, and the terrible things we'll do to turn back time. Directed by Mary Lambert from King's own screenplay, the film follows the Creed family as they move to a quiet house in Maine, the kind of perfect rural dream that only exists in Stephen King's stories, right before everything goes horribly wrong. Behind their new home lies a path that leads to an old pet cemetery, and just beyond it, a burial ground with the power to bring the dead back to life. When tragedy strikes, Louis Creed learns what lies beyond the deadfall, and how impossible it is to live with what comes back. The story blends small-town Americana with pure existential horror, asking not just, what if you could bring someone back, but what if you shouldn't? Lambert's direction gives it that unmistakable late 80s tone, clean suburban visuals that hide something deeply wrong beneath. The cast sells it perfectly. Dale Midkiff as Louis, Denise Crosby as his wife, and Fred Gwynne as their kind but doomed neighbor Judd, whose warning, "sometimes dead is better," became one of the most chilling lines in horror history. On VHS, Pet Sematary was everywhere. It had the name, the book, and that unforgettable cover art. The cracked ground, the cat, and those yellow eyes. But beneath the marketing was a movie that hit a nerve. Not just scary, but sad. It's one of the few horror films that feels haunted by its own story. The 2019 remake had solid performances and a few clever reversals, but it struggled to capture the eerie, grounded sadness of the original. Where Lambert's version felt personal and intimate, the new one felt clinical. All atmosphere, no heart. The 1989 Pet Sematary remains one of the great VHS-era Stephen King adaptations. Rough around the edges, but filled with genuine dread. It's not about monsters in the woods. It's about the monster we all face eventually. Grief. And the price we pay when we try to outsmart it. Because sometimes, dead really is better. Poltergeist, 1982. Remade as Poltergeist, 2015. Before the 2015 remake tried to drag it into the age of smartphones and CGI, Poltergeist from 1982 was already one of the most iconic haunted house movies ever made, a perfect storm of 80s suburban horror that blended family drama, visual spectacle, and genuine terror. Produced by Steven Spielberg and directed by Tobe Hooper, the film centers on the Freeling family, living the American dream in a new California suburb. That dream quickly turns into a nightmare when strange events begin to shake their perfect home. Furniture moving on its own, voices whispering through the TV, and their youngest daughter Carol Ann disappearing into another dimension through the static. With Spielberg's sense of wonder and Hooper's horror instincts, Poltergeist walked a perfect line between blockbuster and nightmare. It wasn't just scary, it was cinematic. The special effects were groundbreaking for the time, but the film's strength came from its emotional core. It wasn't about demons or possessions. It was about a family trying to hold on to each other while their world literally tore itself apart. When it hit VHS, Poltergeist became one of the biggest rental titles of the decade. The box art, that tiny girl pressing her hands against the glowing television, became instantly iconic. Everyone knew the line, "They're here." It was the kind of movie families rented together, not realizing how deeply it would unsettle them. The 2015 remake followed the same basic outline, but missed the magic. It was darker, louder, and faster, but lacked that mix of awe and fear that made the original unforgettable. Where the 1982 version built tension through mood and mystery, the remake tried to explain everything, and in doing so, lost what made the original so haunting. Revisiting Poltergeist on VHS today is like stepping back into the heart of 80s horror. Bright colors, practical effects, and that unmistakable feeling of danger hiding behind everyday life. It's not just a ghost story. It's a reminder that horror can be both big and personal, terrifying and beautiful all at once. Some movies didn't need to be remade, and Poltergeist might be the clearest example. The original already got it perfect. House on Haunted Hill, 1959. Remade as House on Haunted Hill, 1999. Before the 1999 remake tried to modernize it with digital ghosts and buckets of blood, House on Haunted Hill terrified audiences 4 decades earlier in 1959. And it did it with nothing more than atmosphere, shadows, and Vincent Price's smirk. Directed by William Castle, the original was part haunted house story, part carnival sideshow. Castle was the king of movie gimmicks, the kind of guy who'd wire up theater seats to buzz during shock scenes, or drop skeletons from the ceiling mid-movie to make people scream. This film was his masterpiece of showmanship, a murder mystery wrapped inside a ghost story, where a group of strangers is locked overnight in a mansion for a chance to win $10,000, if they survive until morning. Vincent Price plays Frederick Loren, a wealthy eccentric with a wicked sense of humor and a wife who may or may not be plotting to kill him. The mansion creaks, the lights flicker, and as the night wears on, paranoia turns deadly. There are skeletons, secret doors, vats of acid, all the ingredients of what would become a horror blueprint for decades to come. When it hit home video in the early VHS era, it became a late-night staple, the kind of black and white classic you'd find in a bargain bin or taped off TV, but always worth revisiting for Price's over-the-top performance and that spooky old Hollywood charm. The 1999 remake amped everything up: gothic sets, gore effects, and a soundtrack straight out of the Scream era. But despite the budget and special effects, it couldn't capture the mischievous energy of the original. Castle's version felt like a ghost story told around a campfire. Simple, theatrical, and genuinely fun. If you grew up with Vincent Price on late-night TV or stacks of dusty VHS horror tapes, House on Haunted Hill is the perfect reminder that sometimes all you need for a great scare is a good story, a dark room, and that grin from Vincent Price. Some remakes find clever ways to evolve familiar nightmares, while others prove that the spark of the originals is tougher to recapture than studios expect. But no matter how you first experience them, late-night rentals or modern reimaginings, each one shows why these stories continue to echo through horror's history. If you haven't seen the earlier entries in the series, be sure to check out parts 1 and 2, and keep an eye out for what's coming next as we keep digging through the past to see what's been brought back to life. Thanks for watching, and remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is someone's favorite.